Oh, yes. Okay. Ready? In
Stays in the clip.
3, 2, 1.
Hey, Hope Brooklyn. Welcome back to another weekly edition of The Takeaway. My name is Bryant. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm here with Ryan, who just preached another sermon on our detox series on anxiety. And so, anxiety is something that I think everyone on a certain scale can relate to, right? No matter how carefree we are, there's always going to be some degree of anxiety. And I think this past year, of all the uncertainties that have been going on, anxiety has been at an all-time high. And so, as you talked about in your sermon, just the ways that we can cultivate a heart and spirit of countering a lot of these anxious thoughts and anxious emotions. I just want to kind of lean into a little bit about the idea of control and fear. Control, anxiety, and fear, because they're so closely knit together. So just love to hear extra thoughts.
So when I was sharing in the sermon, it's interesting that Jesus' kind of exhortation to not be anxious, to not worry about tomorrow, comes right after his kind of discussion of money and the role of money in our lives. And I think what he's trying to get at there, and I said it a bit in the sermon, is that money is directly related to control, that through money and wealth we actually try to control the outcomes of our lives. But control is ultimately rooted in a fear of lack, a fear of not having enough, a fear of not being able to have what I need for my life, my sustenance. And ultimately, that's what Jesus is getting at. He says, people are obsessed with what they're going to wear, what they're going to eat, and what they're going to drink. Mm-hmm. Those are the core things we need to seemingly to be human. And if we fear we're not going to have those things, if we believe in a world of scarcity, where those things are things that need to be fought over and acquired so that I can somehow control my life continuing, then I resort to control because I have this fear that I'm not actually going to have access to those things. And so it creates anxiety because I'm unsure, or I believe that we live in a world where those things I may not be able to acquire those things. Right. And so I think those are how those kind of ideas are related, that the fear of lack creates anxiety, which leads us to want to control.
Sure. Yeah, and as sometimes you gave some great examples of how we can cultivate a life that is like detached from anxiety. But I know oftentimes we get into this spiral, right? When you're in the abyss of anxiety, it's hard to see your way out. And so what are some good practices we can also incorporate into our spiritual lives that when we're in the midst of that moment of kind of spiraling, to pull ourselves out?
Yeah, I think you can tackle this from two directions. Kind of like the habits I was able to share in the sermon were preventative habits. They're things we do to orient ourselves towards what I called in the sermon the holy present, right. To orient ourselves towards the care and trust of God. And that way, if we're oriented in that direction, then we can somehow be free from anxiety a bit. I think though what you're talking about is this spiral, is that, like I said in the sermon, we also don't always get this correct. And because we're human, we're flawed, and we fail, there is a sense in which, as much as I maybe embrace these habits, I might still face these things.
Sure.
And I think this is where it goes back to the habit of prayer, where prayer is not just a preventative measure, but prayer is something I do in the moment, in the midst of the pain. I think we have two great examples from Jesus' life. When he's about to be arrested and handed over to the Jewish leaders to be tried in his sham trial, what he does is he falls on his knees and he prays honest, powerful prayers about the state of his soul. Mm-hmm. And then on the cross, we hear him pray to the Father. He has the famous Aramaic line where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And in this moment, Jesus is identifying with our prayers, our honest, open prayers, where in the middle of great trial and pain and suffering, we fall before the Father and seemingly say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so I think prayer is not just preventative, it can be the thing we do in the moment when we're spiraling. I think a lot of times we think, I need to kind of become more spiritual so that I can pray. And it becomes difficult for us then to pray in our terrible moments where we don't feel too spiritual, don't feel too close to God. And I think actually that's a false dichotomy, that in your worst moments, when you feel as far from God as possible, when you don't feel as quote unquote spiritual, you can actually in those moments fall on your knees and pray the prayers that are born when the dark night of the soul hits.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. And yeah, definitely, from like what you're sharing and what you mentioned in the sermon, I love that the relinquishing of our powers towards God, and not like, okay, what are some, like, there's definitely healthy practices and like practical practices we can do, but the principle of being able to relinquish that control, because I think that's oftentimes, I know I catch myself when I'm in a moment of anxiety, I need to start grabbing hold of things to stabilize, to gain control. It's kind of like surfing on the train, on the subway as you're riding. You're shaking, you're wobbling, and you're trying to grab hold of anything. But I like building those habits of prayer and relinquishing that towards God.
Yeah, I think a great image of this kind of radical trust in God comes from C.S. Lewis's space trilogy in the second book called Paralandra. And in this book, the main character gets transported to this planet called Paralandra, where it's completely covered in water, and all the islands on the water actually are not rooted. They actually flow, they surf along the waves. And in this land, the one thing that is forbidden of the people of this world is to reside in what they call the fixed land, which would be like our land that doesn't move. And there's a spiritual lesson in here in that it's when we reside on the fixed land, when we think, I can't follow the ebb and flow of God's will. I can't follow the leading of the Spirit. I actually don't trust that God's going to bring me where I need to go, that I need to uproot myself from His presence and put myself in a place where I'm in control. Right. And actually the great irony is in that story, by staying a night on the fixed land, it ended in death. And I think there's a parallel here where to truly trust in God is to ride the ebb and flow of his waves and His currents,
Sure.
to completely be led by the Spirit and entrusted to Him.
Yeah.
Versus the temptation to say, no, I'm gonna be in control. I'm gonna be in that space where I have the final say.
Yeah.
And ironically, that when we do that, when we fail to cede and just say, God, take me wherever you take me, that's actually when we invite death in.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's actually one of the hardest parts of the Lord's Prayer for me. Give us our daily bread.
Yeah.
Where, even when the Israelites were in the desert, it was like, hey, don't save any for tomorrow.
Yeah, you're not asking God for 401k.
Yeah, like that's a nightmare to me. Knowing that, like, I don't have my bread for tomorrow. Like, I need to know what I'm eating, meal prep for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
But the idea of, like, relinquishing that control and saying, God, I trust you that every day.
Yeah.
And, as you mentioned in your message too, like, it's not about what we own. It's not about wealth. It's not about, so I think that's a really counter, cultural way of thinking of encountering and overcoming anxiety. And just one final thought, as we talk about anxiety, a lot of times it's triggered by something. Yeah. I know in the beginning of the sermon you're like, okay, this is a spiritual message on anxiety, which is absolutely correct. But there's a spiritual tie that happens, right? There's a source sometimes that all these anxious thoughts and anxious moments derive from. Yeah. And like, what are some like practical ways that spiritually we can do to identify those things and be able to bring that to God?
Yeah, again, like I said in the sermon, I'm not a psychologist, but I do think our souls are directly connected to our bodies and minds. This idea that we have our spiritual lives and we have like our physical lives. That's a completely foreign idea to the Bible. We're whole creatures. We're body and soul together, like Thomas Aquinas calls. We're ensouled bodies and embodied souls. And I think to identify those triggers from a spiritual perspective, I think you should go see a mental health counselor to identify maybe what are those mental triggers. But I think the spiritual triggers often come from a lack of deep understanding of God's grace and His goodness. I think a lot of the times we understand theoretically that God is a good God. I think we understand that He's gracious somehow. But a lot of the times I don't often think we think it applies to us.
Right.
And so I think a way to identify that is to say, like, do I really have a firm grasp on how good and gracious God is? Because if I did, if that was the space out of which I lived my life, anxiety would be a lot harder for us because we'd be a people so inundated with the grace and goodness of God that would be the entire lens through which we saw the world.
Yeah.
I think that's what Jesus is inviting us into in the Sermon on the Mount. To be like the birds and the flowers, to see the world from the perspective of God is the caretaker, caring for the world, versus there's this kind of mentality of scarcity that actually God is distant and he's kind of like, the distant God of the deists who doesn't really interfere with the lives of men. No.
Right.
God is so caring and good that he knows the hairs on your head. So I think that's a lot of the source. I think to identify that is to really ask ourselves, how deeply do we know the grace and the goodness of God? And that we cultivate that understanding by indwelling and living in the story of Scripture, which is why reading the Scriptures becomes so important, listening to the Scriptures, hearing them with community, because it's that story that reminds me, this is the real story, not the false story that I tell myself that God is distant and doesn't care.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for that extra insight, Ryan.
Absolutely.
And Hope Brooklyn, we're praying for you. And I hope that in moments of anxiety, as Ryan mentioned, really understanding and holding on to the truth that God cares for you as our Heavenly Father. And so, till we see you again next week, God bless and peace be with you.
God bless.